A very warm welcome to the discussion on strengthening India's governance capabilities at Harvard India Conference 2022. I'm Nirali. I'm a second year student at the Harvard Kennedy School. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the India Conference at Harvard is co-hosted by graduate students of Harvard University. We have a strong legacy of bringing together leaders from all sectors of India for a meaningful dialogue on issues facing India. Before I introduce the panel, I would like to go over a couple of housekeeping items. The session, the session will begin with the panelist discussion for the first 45 minutes, post which it will open to the audience for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A feature available at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You could also upvote a question asked by another attendee. Doing so will increase the likelihood of a particular question being answered. Finally, please tag us on social media with the hashtag ICH2022 when you share insights from the session. Now, I will provide an overview of the session and our esteemed speakers. The session on governance ties very well with the theme of this year's conference, India at 2030. If India needs to realize its potential, we must evaluate the governance capacity of the country and ensure that we have a strong foundation to implement social, political, and economic reforms. To discuss India's governance needs, we have three phenomenal speakers with us today who together have spent years both researching and implementing ideas to improve India's governance apparatus. Our first guest for today is Yamini Iyer. Yamini is the President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, a leading public policy think tank in India. Yamini has worked extensively on building state capacity and governance. She founded the Accountability Initiative, which pioneered a new approach to tackling public expenditures in India. Yamini is a role model for many women who want to make an impact in Indian policymaking. We're so honored to have you here, Yamini. Our second guest for today is Dr. P.V. Ramesh. Dr. Ramesh is a physician turned IAS officer who served as the principal advisor to the Andhra Pradesh Chief Minister until October 2021. He has 36 years of leadership experience with the state, national, and international governments across various portfolios: finance, rural electrification, mobility, and public health. He has also been a keen observer of the role of institutions and is committed to studying their interaction with society. Dr. Ramesh is currently teaching at Kautilya School of Public Policy, inspiring young minds to enter the field of policymaking. To moderate this fantastic discussion, we have the writer and podcaster Amit Verma. Amit has written for the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, The Observer, and almost every prominent Indian publication. Currently, Amit runs one of the biggest policy podcasts in India called The Seen and the Unseen that a lot of us policy wonks turn to stay up to date with policy issues in India. On a lighter note, we're all looking forward to seeing Amit moderating a 1-hour discussion instead of his usual freewheeling 4-hour format. Thank you, panelists and audience, for joining us today. It's truly an honor to have you here. Handing it over to Amit now.
Virali, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's an honor also to share the virtual stage, as it were, with these two fine guests. And everyone who's watching this will note that we have started on time. And what does that prove? That proves that it isn't the Indian state that is organizing this, it is civil society. Now, I want to sort of begin by, with a thought for both my guests, with a question for both of you, really, that when we think of the state, we often think of it through really simple lenses in stereotypical ways. For example, some people might think of the state in a my bap kind of way, that all our problems have, wherever there's a problem, we need the state to solve it. Others will sort of think of the state as a tool of whichever politician happens to come to power, much as, Jyoti Joseph's latest book, A Silent Coup, kind of lays out. And others, perhaps like me, will think of the state as this rent-seeking parasitic beast, which is, as oppressive as it was in the 19th century, when that was the whole point of the state being there. Now, all of these are part of the truth, but all of these are kind of simple ways of sort of looking at what the state really is. And so for me, this is a great opportunity to ask you guys about this, because both of you have been intimately involved in working with the state and understanding its different nuances. And I'm sure many of the viewers of this must share the kind of simplistic, impressionistic notions of the state that I just outlined. So, turning to you, Yamini, first, can you guys talk about, if you have to describe the state to a layperson, what is this state that we are talking about? What is this problem? What's going on here? How would you do that?
Amit, in so many ways, the state is all of the things that you describe. I mean, if I think of my own relationship with the state, I'm a child of the 1990s. Most of the audience may not remember the good old days when we had to share. I grew up as a teenager with two other sisters. So there was three of us, all about the same age range, three teenage girls, one landline, fighting and squabbling. And half the time the landline wouldn't work. This was the early 1990s. By the mid to late 1990s, we were part of that hurrah moment when the state had finally exited our lives. There was this sense of opportunity for all of us cosmopolitan students of a life outside of the state. The private sector was beginning to boom, and everyone was celebrating the move away from the labyrinth of red tape and the oppression of the state. India was about to arrive on the world stage. And I had always been interested in some very confused way, this whole world of public policy. I wanted to travel the country. I wanted to work in for social change with some sort of vague idea in my head. And it was pretty clear to me, in fact, no one pushed the idea of trying to sit for the civil services. If you want to work in the social space, if you want to work with people, if you want to work on social change, the NGOs are the place to go. So I ended up in an NGO very soon after I finished my college. And as I traveled around rural Rajasthan and rural Bihar, I, as a child that was celebrating the exit of that repressive state, found myself in conversation with people that were waiting desperately for the state to arrive. The state will come, sarkar aayegi to school banega, sarkar aayegi to sadak banegi, sarkar aayegi to aspatal aayega. And we were all working on markets, what is it that will connect people to markets? And people looked at us and said, sadak nahi hai. सड़क कौन बनाएगा सरकार बनाएगी वो सरकार के लिए इंतजार कर रहे थे there was this aspiration and hope it was not just the mai baap actually it was a source of hope and aspiration and that contrasted so sharply with my own personal celebration of a life outside of the state. And then of course there's the oppressive part of the state, one that all of us have experienced in COVID. I was just our pre-conversation of celebrating today that I can drive around in my car on my own without the absurdity of wearing a mask because the state is equally oppressive. It's all of these things. But in all the many encounters I've had with the Indian state, the one thing that I never expected and that has surprised me the most is we as citizens think of the state as something outside of ourselves, something that we give power to, something that exercises power over us, something that we want to exit and run away from, something that is a source of hope and aspiration for us. But in years of talking to grassroots level bureaucrats and talking to them about what they can do to improve learning, improve sanitation, whatever it is that they are tasked with, the one thing that struck me as really powerful was that while the person inside the state was exhibiting all those signs of power and demonstrating that power to me as an outsider, to everybody around me, when I would talk to them about what they could do as a state, they often say, Sarkar chahti hai to bahut kuch kar sakti hai. If the state wants to, it can do a lot. And it struck me, actually it didn't even strike me, it struck my research associate, Vinci, who was fresh in this world. And so she noticed this much more than I did. And she said, but isn't he the state? And that to me is one of the most powerful images of the challenge of state capacity that we're going to be talking about today, that the state is a source of power and patronage for all those that strive very hard to come into the state. But their lived experience of being the state is of that powerful actor that can do a lot of things, but those things are outside of me. If the government wants, it can do everything. And I don't notice the irony of me being the government sitting there. So you will talk to the prime minister, he'll blame his ministers. You'll talk to the ministers, he'll blame his secretaries. You talk to the secretary, they will blame the deputy secretary. Talk to the deputy secretary, they'll blame the state, and so on and so forth until you get to the citizen. That's the challenge.
Wow, that's so well put. And I love that whole aspect of it's not just people outside the state who blame the state, people inside the state also blame the state. Like, who is the state? Ramesh, I'll ask you the same question, but with an added layer, which is that, one of the things I noted in your remarkable CV is that you've not only been part of government in India at really senior levels, but you spent a lot of time with international organizations, many, many years working abroad and sort of understanding the state from there. Now, one would imagine that states everywhere should essentially be the same. You have a monopoly on violence, you have the same kind of incentives, Parkinson's law applies everywhere. But it is clear that in India, the state, there are unique problems. It's kind of more dysfunctional than in many places. In some places in the world, surprise, surprise, the state does function pretty well. So, from a point of view of these differences also, like when you sort of went abroad, you did all these stints. Were there did some facets of the Indian state appear as a strong contrast to what you saw outside? So tell me a little bit about this also as we try to understand the nature of the Indian state and the challenge that is before us.
Thanks, Amit, and thanks to the organizers, and good day to everyone. No, it's a wonderful listening to Amini. I belong to a generation earlier. I've grown up in a small town in Andhra Pradesh, in a lower middle class family. With a lot of we had a lot of faith in the government. Let me put it that way. And then when I went off to study medicine in CMC Vellore, and I did fairly well, I thought I had every option in my life. And then what would I be? Should I be a cardiologist? Or, those days, the cardiac surgeon was really at top of the pack. Now, I labored over this for a year, and I said, no, I need to do more in life. And the best I could do is let me join the civil services and then see I would transform the lives of the people. Those in the rural areas, those in the urban areas. And then CMC training was really this mix of public health, the social causation of disease, at the same time focusing on clinical excellence. So the training was very different from a traditional medical college. So when I joined IAS, I really believed that this was a transformational instrument. And then when everyone chose to work in a better off places, I consciously asked for posting in the Naxal affected areas, the tribal areas. In fact, my entire field career between 86 and 96, when I left to work for International Fund for Agriculture Development, was all in those districts in different positions of the Naxal affected areas. Now, it taught me a lot because the mainstream political system actually had withdrawn in those days because of the left-wing insurgency, and they left it to the police and the paramilitaries to manage it. And then, of course, in between were people like me who were trying to mediate a space in such a way that we could still get things going. So that was the biggest learning for me, to see what happens when the state is in acute conflict with its own citizens. And the first lesson I learned was to go down to the grassroots level and then understand, get out of the ivory towers, mix with the people, work with them. And the biggest lesson I learned very early in my career as a subdivisional magistrate was the land issue. The biggest challenge really in most of these areas, and the genesis of this conflict between the state, actually it's the revenue, forest departments, the forest police revenue against the people. It's as simple as that. So, this really gives rise to this long-term, the conflict and the tension with the state. So you don't have citizens feeling that they are part of the state, but they are really at war with the state. And that's the big lesson I learned, how to harmonize and how to work in such a circumstance, and yet really involve people. So in fact, my entire learning, I must say, was in these 10 years working with the people in the midst of conflict. I didn't have really a interface with the political executive because the political establishment had withdrawn. from these areas and left it to the paramilitaries to manage. 96, I started working abroad for International Fund for Agriculture Development across Asia Pacific. And later I moved on to United Nations in the Middle East and Africa, Europe, and then Afghanistan. I really worked for 2 years just in the post-conflict. I was part of the mission team that prepared the Afghanistan reconstruction project in 2002. Later, I was with the World Bank building their customs institutions, and later we are representative of the UN Population Fund. But I mean, the common thread that I learned from when I came back in 2009, rejoined the government again, the big lesson I take away working across the world, plus especially in those countries that were in either pre-conflict or peri-conflict or post-conflict, or those which are being rebuilt or which are normal, is that how much the cultural, political, historical legacies influence the contemporary nature of the state, and its capacity as well as its character. Both capacity and the character of the state is so much determined ultimately by the citizens, the leadership, the legacies, and of course the externalities, which many a time are invisible. Now, let it be democracies or notional democracies, autocracies, or dictatorships, or those which are virtually crumbling states. I mean, my biggest learning had been that each context is unique, and each society and the state is unique. And unless the leaders recognize that the system, the situation is so complex, and no country is homogeneous, and then it is so simple that it's easy to govern. Governance really means much more proactive engagement with the citizenry. When I came back to India after a gap of nearly 12 to 13 years in 2009, and took over as Secretary Health, and later long stint of 5 years as Secretary Finance in Andhra government. You know, the one thing I've learned is a lot has changed this 12 years, and a lot had not changed. What had changed really is the expansion of the political executive and the legislative machinery into execution, into the institutions. And the institutions have become much, much weaker. And in fact, in most of my work actually on how the institutions of governance ultimately contribute to the development, progress, and the stability of a state. And the big learning I had brought back and applied and then understood, especially in my own practice as secretary to the government, was that you ultimately need institutions, number one, who believe in themselves. Number two is that they have the capacity to perform whatever functions they're assigned to perform. Third is that has to be a sense of ownership. Now, when I started my service in 85, I believed that I was the government. I mean, in this subdivision or in this district, if I did not address these problems, perhaps nobody else would. And the machinery has to be involved. People had to be involved. All the instruments of the state had to be involved in order to not only resolve the problems, but also to see that they move to the next step. I think my own understanding as we move towards the 21st century and 2020s is that the state capacity has indeed declined. And it's also confidence of the civil service and its ability to be the agents of transformation is today far less than what it was when I joined. The third most important thing was there were many role models to look up to when I joined the service. I mean, those who really were transformational figures, much larger than life, people who sacrificed their safety, comfort for the sake of the country at large. And I see very few of them today. So, I mean, we've reached a stage in history. Of course, I mean, I think this is the way that the world evolves. Each country and each society has a different trajectory, different pace, at which the institutions evolve. I think the big challenge and big lesson that I have learned is, do societies, nations, look at their institutions, look at their context, and address, reconfigure themselves, restructure themselves, re-empower themselves. And in this, do they see all the institutions, and by which I mean really the government per se, I mean what we see as the political executive and its extended arms, and the civil society, and the citizenry at large, because ultimately the governments don't exist for themselves. I mean, it's we the people of India, who are the Republic of India, and we together really determine the trajectory in which we go. I mean, you said at the very beginning, different people perceive the state in different ways. And really all of it is true, what you said. And each one of us, depending on our station in life and station in society, tend to apportion ourselves. Is the state as a threat, state as a omnivore, and state as the my bop, it depends on to which segment I really belong to. And the state, I believe, in our country is yet to figure out what they are. And they would like really to be the omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent God is what perhaps the political leadership would like to. And I don't exclude the bureaucratic leadership from that.
So, some profound insights in that. And I want to double click on a couple of things. And the first one seems to be really critical to understand, which is where you pointed out that when we think of the state, we have to think of local cultural contexts, that you can't just think of the state in abstract terms. We can all have frameworks for looking at the state and talk about it in that way, but when you get down on the ground and you're actually interacting with the state and trying to get stuff done, culture sort of determines what the state is like, how it is viewed, what it does, how it functions, all of those things. And I've heard Yamini speak about this in the past as well. So I'd like you guys to make this concrete for the viewers, to sort of go beyond these abstract terms, and maybe give me examples of this, of bring it to life, that how does it function, how can we understand it, because I think that would just make the problem a little more vivid. Ramesh, would you like to go first, since you brought the context?
Okay. I mean, no, when I said the context is everything, everyone, the constitutional designers and the framers, or the parents of the Constitution, had this very aspirational, idealistic view of the state, that we, the people of India, would do all these things. But this really is not followed up with the institutional framework. I mean, you have the directive principles, you have the fundamental rights, but how do you really translate this in aspirational framework into this very complex, multicultural, very iniquitous society? I've been working across South Asia and working also across Southeast Asia. The stark difference I've noticed is how conformist the societies are, or how homogeneous the societies are in East Asian context. Because of the homogeneity in a village, you don't have these high inequities or high social hierarchies. So which really enables you, in a way, you're working with people who believe in themselves and believe in the mutuality of interests, that collectively together, we need to build our future. Now, that is the challenge actually in most of South Asia, and particularly, I believe, the old British India, the Bangladesh India, maybe I would include Nepal, because Bhutan, Sri Lanka are a little different, and Maldives is very different, though they're the SAARC countries. And having worked quite extensively in these countries for almost about 6 years, however they're dated, they belong to 90s, the common thread I find, and what really have remained unresolved, are some of those issues which are fundamental to our society, the construct architecture of our culture, our legacies, our history, and which is our implicit acceptance of inequities as natural. Whether it's social inequities, cultural inequities, whether it is economic inequities, is very natural. Second is that we have always been a society that was ethnically very differentiated. We had many religions that have been in existence. the caste is a very important construct in this entire social glue and the kinship relations that really work in building the building blocks of the state. Then there are very unique context of the Adivasis, the northeastern India or the rest of India, which has been given very special, very specific position in the constitution. The issues of gender, these are, and the issues of gross regional inequities. I mean, we really are a continent in real sense of the term, and each state is very distinct in every sense of the term in terms of language, culture, and within the state, there are huge intra-state diversities. Now, have we been sensitive? I mean, the constitution broadly assumes that we live in this future paradise in which the very institutions and the safeguards that have been built would take care of them. But then look at, have we configured the institutions to address some of these fundamental contradictions that exist in our society, in our culture, in our context? I think this remains a perennial challenge to every satire, and we've sort of quietly swept them under the carpet and say, no, they don't exist. Let's not bother about, gender inequities. The women workforce participation is falling in the country. It's not a big deal. It happens. Caste system. I mean, the whole fundamental electoral arithmetic is based on caste. And, we say, no, that we have addressed through reservations. Now, I think fundamentally we have not configured our institutions or the institutional dynamics or the processes. Or the much more important thing that I notice between the developed world and our context is also, we have not really said that we have the social compact that say that there is a mutuality of interests. Now, it's not the richer versus the poor. It is not the upper caste versus the lower caste. It's not the Muslim versus Hindu. It is that unless everyone has these opportunities that to really realize their full potential, we'll never really be a society that realizes our full potential. Now, we could say that, we are growing at double-digit growth, but then when half our children are malnourished, and half our women have anemia, and 30-40% of our girl children either don't go to school or drop out of school at the end of the primary level. How many centuries do we need before we can really realize our full potential? You really are shedding them. And then we have this complex reality of the communicable disease burden and also the non-communicable disease burden. I mean, being a doctor, I just want to take back and then stop before long-winding conversation. How much is this disease burden and how much is it a drag on the economy? Because if I have tuberculosis, I'm not optimally contributing to the economy. In addition to that, whether the state or myself have to invest in my own treatment. So there is a double jeopardy staring at us. So to summarize, I think some of the fundamental contradictions that the constitutional or the authors had assumed would be addressed as we spoke, I think has yet to happen. The social contract is not realized. Actually, I believe that people like me have seceded from the so-called real India, where people still continue to labor, continue to strive, continue to suffer, continue to be deceased. I mean, those millions of them who marched back homes from different states. I mean, we would love to ignore that and say that life it's a hunky-dory all along. It's a new India all along. So I think there are real fundamental challenges. They need to be talked about and they need to be addressed. And I don't believe that the political system or even the bureaucratic system, which is increasingly losing its responsibility for the state, is a big challenge.
So let me throw the same question at Yamini, but also mention this fantastic talk which she gave, which I encourage all the viewers to check out, where I discovered this framework you spoke about, rules versus responsiveness. Whereas a broad point you were kind of making there is actually fairly similar to the sense that on the one hand, the state must follow rules. There must be rules set out for how it functions, and that's essential. And these rules are imagined would come from a universal sense of how states are and all of that. But at the same time, for a state to make a difference on the ground, it has to be responsive. It has to work together with local people in local conditions and all of that. And this, as you pointed out, is a dichotomy that is very hard to get these two together, because where there are rules, that leads to an incentive for centralization and all of that. But for a state to be really effective, it has to work at the local level. All problems, in a sense, are essentially local and all of that. So tell me a little bit about this framework of yours, and also if you have any illustrations that kind of bring alive and make apparent the mistake of looking at the state as one thing, as opposed to saying that a state in Tripura will necessarily be different from a state in Bihar or the state in Karnataka and all that. And you have to take, so are there any instances which kind of, give light to this?
Thanks, Amit. So, I think the challenge with the Indian state in some ways, as I've thought about this more over the years, is if you look back and, as Ramesh was saying as well, to our founding moment and what are the framers of modern India envisaged the state to do. In some senses, the imagination was that the state would be the driver of deep social change and would take India on a path towards the ideals of liberty, justice, equality. And while that might have been an appropriate framing for the time, and essentially, as you were building a new nation state, you didn't necessarily have the patience for what long-term social mobilization would achieve. The assumption that our founding fathers rightly had was, as democracy would deepen, the twain would meet. The state as this sort of as the anchor of social change would enable and empower the process of democratization, and collectively we would move on towards the path of an equitable society that believed in principles of values of liberty, equality, justice, all of which are framed within, find their way into our constitution. In some senses, what this did, I think, to the culture of the civil services, which is really the state that we experience in an everyday way. For us, the state is not as much, the politician is certainly part of it, but it is ultimately it's the passport office, the license office, the BDO, the sarpanch, the panchayat secretary. That's the state for the average Indian, right? I think what it did is that it create, particularly at the elite level of the All India services, it created an imagination of the state both as being distanced from people, because your job was to engineer social change. And that was part of also how it was organized. That's why you have state cadres, people from different parts of the country coming into a cadre, being a little separate away from people with the lal batti and all the paraphernalia. In its own way, that paraphernalia was necessary, even though we look at it and make fun of it now, but that paraphernalia was necessary to create this imagination of the state as that all-knowing leader of change for India. And inevitably, therefore, it also lent itself to deep centralization. So it was an all-powerful, distance from people, deeply centralized. And that became the state itself. In fact, as we we also wanted, therefore, to acquire, Lant has this nice phrase of it looks like the state. So we acquire all this imagination of a rational, Weberian, rule-based state that would function on its hierarchies, through its rules, with that file going up and down, neatly moving the system in a way that would keep its distance from citizens, not be deeply embedded, and ensure that it was delivering justice. Well, the state was tasked with managing our social lives. It was going to give us schools. It was going to give us health centers. It was going to help negotiate complex social inequities around caste, around gender, around religion. So the state, in its everyday expectation, was actually expected to be embedded in society. And I think that's kind of where the tensions start unfolding. As the task of development too has expanded, what we want the state to do is not simply build a school. We also want to ensure that the state is creating a school where teachers show up, No, we want to create a school where teachers show up and they actually teach children in a way that they could actually learn something. So we are wanting a lot more things from the state. But we have a structure of the state which was supposed to be distanced, which was supposed to follow a set of rules. And increasingly, we also say that in order for the state to be able to do all of these things, it needs to understand the context in which it is. Now, how does it do that? It doesn't. It falls back on its rules, because that's the only knowledge that the state has internally in and of itself. So it's sort of like, you know, when you travel to America with your Indian plug and you forget at the airport to buy the convertible, you take your plug and you keep trying to fix it, fit it into a socket that is just not meant for. In so many ways, I feel like the state is trying to do just that, right? So we went through this phase, for instance, as democracy deepened, there was the pressures from below pushed the Indian state towards democratic decentralization, the 73rd and 74th Amendments, pushing to say the state cannot afford to be this distance from its people. We have to do an equitable sharing of powers and resources in a way that the state at the grassroots responds to the needs at the grassroots. We managed to do this in the form of a constitutional amendment, but that actual sharing of powers simply never occurred. As you start diving deeper into understanding why that is, a lot of it has to do with the fact that we created an elite architecture of the state that was meant by definition to be distanced from people. So then when you expect that the district magistrate, who has sat through, after now increasingly been from engineering school, has sat through a very difficult exam, walks into Labasna and is told, you are the god of this country, now you are going to expect that person to take orders from one panchayat sarpanch of some rural village that is speaking in the vernacular, whereas I'm an English-speaking babu with the lal batti. The cultural clash is really deep. And that's one of the reasons why in a large part, particularly of North India, but in many parts of Southern and Western and Eastern India too, that actual devolution is resisted less by politicians and much more by the bureaucratic structure. It's simply not designed to be embedded in its everyday functioning. And then what is, and so you get these really absurd contexts in which the state functions. My favorite example, and it's one I use often, but because it's so evocative of this challenge of a state that is distanced from people, that's the state is making rules that seem imminently sensible when we are sitting in a Zoom room. So take this one. In the, I think it was in sort of mid-2000s, there was a fire in a school in Kumbakonam in Tamil Nadu, where a midday meal was being prepared in a small room. And the school did not have any fire safety equipment. As a result, there were a lot of young lives lost, a huge tragedy. Now, the midday meal is financed by the Government of India's centrally sponsored scheme, Midday Meals, and rules are made sitting across this sort of hierarchy. So over time, in response to this awful incident, the Government of India came up with what is a perfectly sensible rule: all schools must have fire safety equipment. And it took a while for that government order to travel, first from Kumbakonam, then to the Tamil Nadu state, then to Government of India, then from Government of India to the rest of the country. In 2010 or 11, as we were tracking finances of schools, we discovered that schools are given a small amount of chutku money. At that point, it was 7,500 rupees, which they're allowed to use. And this whole story itself tells you so much about the centralized nature of the state, which they're allowed to use for spending on things that schools need. This was under the erstwhile Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which is a centrally sponsored scheme for schools. Bihar had a whole bunch of schools which, for a very complicated set of reasons, still didn't have a school structure, school building. There was a budget line item in the Excel sheet saying buildingless schools, which were allocated to, which were given this 7,500 rupees, but they didn't have a building. As there was school. It was a school. There was a teacher, there were children, there were books, there was teaching, there was probably a tree under which the activity was happening, and they were awaiting their building. Now, the government order had come to say you need to make sure you have fire safety equipment. And the fire safety equipment had to be purchased out of the 7,500 rupees, because Government of India knows better than the school how to spend that 7,500 rupees. And so the school without a building had to find some complicated way of purchasing a fire safety equipment. They didn't actually need the equipment, they needed the voucher so that they would get something called a utilization certificate, which is that magic bullet thing. Without the utilization certificate, nothing moves. And so there you have it. Now, those 7,500 rupees could have been used to get an extra teacher, to get some more teaching learning material, whatever. Sitting in Delhi, it was perfectly sensible. You don't want a fire, but sitting in Purnia and Bihar, in this one particular village where there's no true school structure, I could have put that money to a lot more use. So the state is meant to actually fulfill its developmental functions. It in fact needs to be a deeply embedded state. It needs to be a state that is agile enough to be responsive and sees itself as in fact delivering those services or delivering on those rights to citizens. But it has been created in an expectation that it is meant to be distanced from the people because its job is to engineer social change towards a particular set of value systems. So actually, I wonder if there's a purpose clash, that the developmental function of the state requires the state to be responsive and recognize citizens. So here's another one. When the right to education was introduced back in 2010, I happened to be traveling around talking to various block education officers. And out of curiosity, I asked them, so now that there's a right to education, what does that mean for you? And across the board, whether it was in Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, it was at the time undivided Andhra Pradesh, or Bihar, the response I got was, yeah, now we have a Kanun aa gaya, it's a law. So we can go to parents and tell them, if you don't send your children to school, you can go to jail because it's a law. Exactly the opposite of what the spirit of the law was meant to be. You could say, this is that apathetic, coercive, callous state. But I think the reality is that the state is culturalized to be that distant entity that is moving these poor people towards a certain goal. But we are also asking the state to be empathetic, to be responsive, to be understanding, to prioritize the people whom it is meant for. The idea of public service is meant to be embedded. It's in that clash that the rules create a certain kind of norm of what Akshay Mangla calls a legalistic norm, where as long as I'm following the file, I'm doing my job. And I've had many officers tell us, our role, performance for us means I respond to the order. And for the rest, as one Bihari very nicely does, education, Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan used to have this position called Cluster Resource Center Coordinator, the CRC, Karta Dharta, boss of all schools across many in their particular clusters. So he said, as long as you follow rules, that's okay. For the rest, you know what a CRCC is? Complete rest in comfortable conditions. This is not, though, the language of an apathetic bureaucrat. It's a language of a perfectly rational way of thinking about my job, because the file is what I'm supposed to be responding to. Everything else is different. So I think these are the sort of context in which you get this, and I think the state is still grappling with that. How do I think about what is the role of the state in negotiating this complex dynamic of social change? Democracy and democratic pressures have created different kinds of new fissures and contestations in that. And therefore, what level of function should be performed at what level of government? And in what way do I interpret that function? Is my function to follow the rule and be coercive, or is my function to actually deliver on a particular good? That remains a conflicting story for what it means to be a bureaucrat, particularly at the grassroots. And that's what unfolds repeatedly in our interactions with the state.
Wonderful. I also have an example of how, a surreal situation can come about because of the centralized impulse of the state. A friend of mine who used to run a restaurant in Bangalore once told me that the excise department had a law that there could only be one entrance to the restaurant, so they could regulate the entry of alcohol. And the fire safety department had a rule that there had to be multiple exits. So no matter what the poor guy did, he was breaking a rule and he had to bribe someone, perhaps both people. That's the kind of mess we are in. So, what has happened is something I was fearful of. Our 45 minutes are almost up. We'll go to the Q&A soon. I had 139 questions, the best questions, as Donald Trump would say, in all caps, for you guys. But I'll go to one final question for both of you, and then we'll leave the floor open to the Q&A questions. And that question is really what you would kind of expect. And if you can sort of give it in a nutshell so we can go on to those questions. And it's a tough one. I've been thinking about it for years and I don't really know the answer. That if we had to, what are the reforms we need? because when you look at the incentives of all the players involved, it seems that reform is almost impossible. Why should the bureaucracy agree to cut itself down in size? Why should the state reduce its own power? What are the reforms we need? What are the practical reforms that are possible? What does the state itself, all the stakeholders within the state, politicians, bureaucrats, what do they feel about it? What is the responsiveness from that end? And what is a low hanging fruit that it is realistically possible to go for?
Yamini first.
You've asked a $1 million question for which we need another 3 hours, or maybe 8, or maybe 16. But
you know where to come for that.
Let me say 2 things. I think one thing that worries me a lot is that increasingly both the state and the citizenry is deeply disenchanted with the state's ability to get things done. And I think that the first most important thing we need to do is to rid ourselves of that disenchantment, that sense that we are looking at different ways of bypassing the state. The welfare state today is a direct benefit state. The public goods that the state is supposed to be delivered is so now an aspiration that's best provided through PPP. And regulation, the less said, the better. So I think that the important thing is to start believing again. And in order to start believing again, we need to, I think, actually, it's a societal conversation of what is the core purpose of the state? What is the normative role of the state in a fast changing society? And I think perhaps we gave up on the state's capability of delivering public goods, particularly after the 1991 moment. We assume that all of this market will take care of many things and state can regulate at best. Well, we never actually built the state's regulatory capacity. Therefore, the state regulated badly, and we never bothered with core public goods. So I think that if there was one thing I could push the state to do, it would actually be to say, stop with everything else. Don't assume that you can bypass your failures by doing direct benefit transfers. Just try and do and believe in your ability to run a few good schools and good health centers. That itself is a task in and of itself. But if we have to rebuild trust and build a genuinely responsive state, then the ability of the state to provide core public goods is the core function of the state. Let's try and get that done. And that also does mean somebody has to lose power, move towards a decentralized state. So for me, the 73rd and 74th amendments are at the heart of this whole challenge.
Ramesh?
Since the conference is looking at 2030 and going forwards, I think there are 3 important changes that are taking place uniformly across the country. One is the demographic transition. And you have a large number of youngsters and people below 25 years. And so you have this cohort with huge expectations, and they are the ones who will lead this country into the next 40, 50 years. The second is the urbanization, the inevitability of the urbanization. We are hardly 1/3 urban. We should be another 10, 15 years. We should be more than 50% urban. And the third is, of course, is the technological transformation that is sweeping across the world. So I think we need to recognize these 3 things and need to reconfigure and focus on what needs to be done. Number one, in my view, the primary importance is to urban development. And I agree with Yamini, especially 74th Amendment. Traditionally what has happened is there's a centralization at the central government, there's a centralization at the state government. Really, there's no decentralization. Nobody wants to decentralize, neither the bureaucrat nor the politician. And I think the imperative really more than I think the constitutional makers were also wary of this 3rd tier of government, because particularly Dr. Ambedkar was wary of this, the village being a cesspool of tradition and caste and hierarchy. But I think we need to really look at the urban governance. The urban governance needs to be addressed in a more comprehensive way. Otherwise, we're never really going to get anywhere in the next 10 years. So the urban governance, I would give a complete different configuration, capacity, mandate. So that is number one. Number two is we need to go back to basics and say that we must ensure that our children cannot be malnourished. They must be educated. They must be healthy. You cannot build a future society without these core entitlements. I mean, these are public goods. We need to acknowledge they are public goods. You know, how you provision them, how you provide them is a secondary issue, but they are public goods. It needs to be recognized. And then increasingly, there is a elder cohort. As the demographic transition shifts, more than 12% are over 65 years. Now this number is likely to grow. We don't have a social safety net. There's no system by which the elderly, and particularly if I'm poor, are protected except for some pensions that are given. But what do I do with pensions? I mean, you can have a direct benefit transfer, but I do not have services that I can procure or purchase at a reasonable level. I think these three things, to me, are key elements. You need to create a social safety net. You need to look at the fundamental services, the urban governance. Then there are I'll just take 2 minutes to mention two things. One is the political system is increasingly becoming centralized on, number one, on populism, number two, on electoral management. And now you have any number of people, you know, whom I consider as electoral mercenaries, now really taking center stage in order to bring in this order into the chaotic electoral process, which can easily distort the electoral outcomes. Because, I mean, we need to recognize the political executive has now taken the center stage, and they would like to have everything, the cake and eat it all, because there's so much of the electoral machinery is really being oiled by the money, by wherever it is coming from. You have the electoral bonds now, the perfectly legitimate instruments that can finance this machine, this juggernaut, which can go on. So I think there has to be a recognition of the fact that we are not operating the political system, the electoral machinery is not on a level playing field. I just leave one more thing with the civil service. You know, we look at the IAS and then say there's a need, in my view, a complete overhaul of this civil service in sense of the way that it is neither center that controls or the state that controls, but there is an autonomous institution like the UPSC that selects them, but also manages their cadre as they go forwards. So you really have much less, because one of the major controlling levers, both at the center and the state, is the way you post. Your posting determines really your future, your life, your ability to contribute or get marginalized in the system. So I think that is a larger issue. But what we have not done in the last 20 years in the name of the Washington consensus or the small government, and the small government also meant small governance. Now, I think we need to recognize this as a reality. The only place where we have strengthened is in the enforcement machineries, but there we have not humanized those machineries. We have not mandated that they need to follow the rule of law, that there is a process by which you operate regulation. Now, so there is a need to go back and look at our human resources, the way they're structured. And lastly, how really the state apparatus works with the civil society, works with the citizenry at large, and the large private sector. Now, today, everybody seems to think the private sector, the markets will address all the maladies of this nation. I think we need to recognize that everybody has a space, and they all are interdependent, interrelated, intricately interconnected. So I believe that we need a much more comprehensive action, and the action is now. And we need to recognize that the world is transforming around us, and we, our own country, if we miss this demographic opportunity, and I think there would be a disaster waiting for us in the 2030s.
Wise words. And for listeners who are listening to that, I should point out that Ramesh mentioned having your cake and eating all of it. Don't eat all of the cake. Sugar is poison. Let's move on to the Q&A now. We've got like 5 minutes for a Q&A. And there's a lovely question that Rohan Sandhu has asked, which I will begin with. He's asked one question each to Yamini and Ramesh. They're kind of linked to each other. And he's kind of getting meta in this, which is what I like. So I have a bias for these kind of questions. So Rohan asks, Yamini, you've devoted a large part of your career approaching the questions of state capacity from the perspective of the frontline agent. If you could take a systems perspective and devise a research agenda to understand the interactions between politics and bureaucracy at a higher level, what would that entail?
In fact, I have consciously stayed away from studying the interaction between politics and bureaucracy, because I think in that process, we have stopped looking at the bureaucracy as a social organization in and of itself, and its own cultures, norms, and values that shape its behavior. But obviously, the bureaucracy is not separate to the political environment in which it is located. The political environment shapes it in very many ways. And in fact, increasingly now, I'm finding the agility of the bureaucracy to recognize political signals and realign itself to those political signals is shaping its behavior. So the central, and it's actually a it's an interplay. And so I would study the centralizing tendencies of the bureaucracy and how they interlink with the centralizing tendencies, or rather the increasing centralizing tendencies of our politics, to get a systems view on how state and politics intersect with one another, and how those two intersections shape the way state and citizens interact with one another. So I would just take and make centralization my locus and look at the bureaucratic culture of centralization and the political culture of centralization, and we'll have a really exciting story. Rohan, if you're up for that, let's talk.
Great, the beginning of a historic collaboration perhaps. And Rohan's question for Dr. Ramesh was this: as someone who has worked with Chandrababu Naidu, Narendra Modi, Jagan within a span of a few years, what would your advice to Yamini be as she develops this agenda? Though now it seems they're developing it together, Rohan and Yamini, but what would your advice to them be?
No, I think Yamini has answered this very well. And I think there is a certain reciprocity between the political centralization and the bureaucratic centralization. And I think the messaging that we didn't receive 20 years ago from the political masters are very well read by my junior colleagues now. So in that sense, there is a very different dynamic and different arithmetic at work. This would be a very interesting proposition as to see what really is going on. The political and the bureaucratic connectivity, I won't call it a nexus, but I think the increasingly these two together are there is a new dynamic which didn't exist earlier. So I hardly seen a voice of dissent. I mean, however, with notable exception, that's me. Very, very few people have ever, because you read the signal and then you design your ideas and the programs and the policies and the actions accordingly. It's very difficult. It's a lonely place out there to really say that, this is the evidence, these are the facts, these are the consequences. So that's, I think, one of the main reasons also why data is being ignored increasingly. And we've seen that with increasing use. So, I mean, where for the election purpose, the big data is being used increasingly, and whereas in policy and its applications, the data has become a poisonous tool.
Great. So, and you said, I won't call it a nexus. By saying that, you called it a nexus. Well done. There are like 800 questions, and I apologize to all the people whose questions I can't ask. What is one to do? Only 1 hour is given. I could go on talking till morning. So this might well be the last question. Dr. Deepti Desai has a question for Yamini. And she asks, there is a thin line between governance and ruling/politics. Based on your research or your opinion, do India's MPs and MLAs have a proper understanding of the two? And how significant is the impact of this gap of understanding?
Well, I don't think that our MPs and MLAs lack an understanding of the complexity of governance. In fact, I think that they have a deep understanding of it, which is precisely why they try to avoid doing anything about it. Simply because it's too complex and they don't necessarily feel a sense of empowerment to be able to respond to that complexity, which is why they love direct benefit transfers. You just get rid of everything and see if we can move. And it doesn't matter whether you can move the money or not, as long as you can tell a good story about your attempt at moving the money, it shows that you're trying to do something. So I actually think that the problem with the problem of governance in how both our political class as well as our bureaucratic class is approaching it is that they recognize its complexity and therefore want to avoid dealing with it. And it sort of speaks to what Ramesh was saying before as well. My sense is that there's a very deep disenchantment internally within the state and externally as citizens who and in what shapes the citizen-state relationship in the capacity and capability of the state. So what tends to happen, therefore, is look at states across the country, good chief ministers centralize, who want to do stuff, centralize everything into the chief minister's office. You want to get anything done in a state, you go straight to the CMO's office. Line departments, local governments, nothing matters as much as the CMO's office. And in that CMO's office, the chief minister, even the prime minister today is sort of feeling this sense of disenchantment and is constantly blaming the bureaucrats. I mean, if you take, I once pulled together for something I was writing, a set of Prime Minister Modi's speeches about the Indian bureaucracy. Then I looked at Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's speeches about the Indian bureaucracy. It's the same story. The instrument in my hands is simply incapable of doing the job that they're supposed to do. Oh, you bureaucrats, you elites, you're so far away from the real people. Without the people, I mean, across, and then there's a wonderful chapter on prime ministers and bureaucrats in all the way up till 1980. So it covers Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Shastri, and they've always had this conflictual relationship. So we've always, our politicians have always looked, it's a classic Jim Hacker, Humphrey narrative unfolding consistently. When there are political pressures to do something, what do these reformist chief ministers do? They say, I want to do X. And if a bureaucrat humbly says, sir, but it's not possible to do, that's a crazy idea, you are charged with being that incapable bureaucrat. So what would you do in that situation? You'd just be quiet and say, yes, sir, yes, sir. So so all of this is a consequence of that disenchantment. We need to break that disenchantment, stop assuming that BCG and PwC can run the Indian state, and actually say the Indian bureaucracy can do it if we as a collective believe in it.
So great. So I think our time is up, but I haven't yet been told to stop. So till the cops come in, I'm just going to continue and I'm going to ask one more question. Therefore, why not? Who can stop me? And this one is sent to me by the organizers, but they haven't given a name. So I don't know who asked this. Onirali says we need to stop. So yeah, okay. So we need to stop. But really quickly, I'll ask, since a question I've already kind of led to it, what reforms do you think are necessary to bring in accountability to state actors? And the second part of the question, can a reform in how data is seen and understood in the state change things? And if I may add to that, is there any way that civil society can use technology, can use big data, can use tools to make the state more accountable? Really crisp answers, please. One sentence, where the full stop comes, you stop right there. Ramesh, we'll begin with you, and then Yamini, and then we'll wind it up.
No, it's absolutely. I think this civil society, this citizenry at large, particularly with the new technology, the social media, has a huge role to play. There is no substitute to civil society's activism in really demanding accountability and responsiveness from the system. I mean, I very much believe that this trust needs to be built. This trust is the key between different elements of the state, and we need to start believing in ourselves and believing in our ability to make a change.
Yamini?
I won't tell you what you can do, but I will tell you what you shouldn't do. Stop assuming that biometric attendance will lead to accountability of bureaucrats. Let's just start there, and we can move on as a society.
Wise words. The upshot of this is that no one is accountable. There's nothing we can do. Just go home, turn off the lights, and eat all the cake. Thank you so much for listening. This was such a pleasure.
Don't put your finger on the biometric machine.
Don't put your finger on the biometric machine.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much for this terrific discussion. I'm sorry to have cut you guys off. Unfortunately, we only have 1 hour, but we can definitely keep going on about this. On behalf of the entire team at the Harvard India Conference, I'd like to thank the panelists for their truly insightful discussion that is drawn from years of experience and fieldwork. Thank you, Amit, for steering this discussion and asking questions with humor that made the discussion engaging for all of us viewers. And finally, I'd like to thank the audiences who tuned in from all parts of the US, India, and elsewhere in the world for excellent questions and comments. With this, we close the day 2 of the Harvard India Conference 2022. We hope you had a great time so far, and we look forward to welcoming all of you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks, Amit, and thanks, Amini. All the best.
Amit.
All the best to
Thanks,
you.
Amit. Look forward to chatting more soon.
Yeah,
Bye.
indeed.
Thank you.